Hey everybody, welcome back to American History with Mr. Finn. As you can see, we have a topic here on the board that we'll get to in a moment. But first, I want to continue where we are in our story of early colonial America. Now remember, when I say colonial America, I'm talking about the fact that the English had colonized the east coast of modern-day United States of America. We were colonies of the mother country, England. And if you remember last class, we were talking about how the idea of mercantilism, which was the economic theory of the day, was that the colonies would send back raw materials to England. England would make products and then sell them to the colonists living here in America. Now, England did this in many places. England is going to go to Australia and India. They're going to be in the Southeast Asia. They're going to be all over the world. But for us, the important thing is to talk about the American colonies. So England is all over the place. They're expanding everywhere, setting up colonies all around the world. But here in America, this is their first major colonial power that's making them a lot of money. And so the important thing for us is to understand how this relationship works, because we're going to see that there's going to be a split in the upcoming years. Now, if you remember, Jamestown was 1607. On a timeline, we are going to be talking today about, as we're getting into the 1700s, let's just say the 1730s, for example. So we're looking at almost 130 years. This is a long time that people have been coming over from England and colonizing the Americas. And remember, we had 13 original colonies. 13. And they were colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina. We know them as states today, but at that time they were colonies. So this is a long period of time, almost 130 years. These colonists have been coming over here. And over time, what's happening as these people are living here is they're having their families, they're creating their different colonies and their legislatures and like small governments in their own areas. They're having children who are now being born here in America. And over the course of 130 years, if you're born here in America, you grow up, you farm, and you live in your colony. You then have a family. You pass away. Your child grows up, has children of their own. You can go through a few generations in 130 years, to the point that after a few, 3, 4 generations, people who are living here in America have never been to England. They don't know much about what's going on in England. They know about their own colony. And the colonies are getting very different from one another. So for example, if you think about New York, New York is a colony, and it's going to be based on manufacturing, building things, certain raw materials that might be different than, say, South Carolina, which is much further south, which would be growing tobacco, starting to grow cotton. In the middle colonies, we look at Virginia. You will start to see grains and more farming. So all of the different colonies, as you go down the coast, are going to start to develop different economic, identities. They're just different from one another. So if you lived in New York, you would consider yourself a New Yorker. If you lived in Virginia, you were a Virginian. You identified with your colony. You didn't really think of all of the colonies as part of the same. You were very, very strongly your own colony's person. That's who you identified as. The other part that is interesting is that because we're so far away from England, England's not really keeping an eye on the American colonies, as long as the colonies are sending raw materials and just doing what they've always done for 130 years, up to 150 years as we get going into the future. So as long as the colonies are doing what they're supposed to, as far as England's concerned, the colonies can basically do whatever they want. Govern yourself, colonies. You have your own legislatures. You have your own governments. You can print currency. You make your own laws in your various different colonies. And so the people living here get very independent from England. They start to consider themselves Americans, not as much English. Some more than others. There's a variety of ways you could feel about it. Not every colonist felt the same, but as we move into the future, more and more are starting to consider themselves American, and then a New Yorker, Virginian, Pennsylvanian. They're very identifying with their colony. So this is important because as we move into the future, that independence is going to lead to the upcoming of the United States of America. So what is the American colony life like? What was it like for these people? So in the American colonies during this time period, it was a very male-dominated, society. The men were the leaders. The men took part in creating governments and voting. The men basically ran the system as a whole. Women would be mostly at home, taking care of the house. This was a household economy, is what we would call it. Not a term that you need to know, so I won't write it on the board. But a household economy is where you make everything at home. Today, we get money and we go to stores and we buy things that people have made. Back then, because it was very rural, which is a term for country, rural, meaning, think of it as country living, not as much like an actual country like the United States. But if you live out in the country, you live in a rural setting. If you live in a city today, you live in an urban one. But it was a very rural lifestyle that these colonists were leading. And so, being out in the country, they had to make things for themselves. So they would make everything at home, from candles to their clothes to tools to everything was made at home. And the women really were the ones who ran the household. And the men would be the ones that would work in the field and then would go to vote and do all the running of the colony that they were in. Another aspect that's super important for us to really identify with is going to be the use of this. Slavery. Now, slavery had started all the way back in the beginning. And slavery is going to be, and this is when, if you don't know, slavery is when you basically have another human being as your property to work for you. And so slavery is not acceptable, not a good thing. Slavery has existed for thousands of years in many different forms, but what we're going to find here is, obviously, it's not right to own another human being and have them work. So this is something that is it's going to start to phase out across the world. Slavery is going to start disappearing in England and in Europe and different places, but in America, it continues to go on. Slavery in America is going to be coming from the continent of Africa, which we've talked about in other videos. So slavery has been in the American colonies since the beginning, and ships would go to Africa and they would trade goods for these people, actual human beings who they would take from Africa, ship to the American colonies, and then the colonists would then purchase these people. It is horrible, and it was a terrible journey for the slaves. Everything about it is just horrible. They're taking people from their homes and then shipping them across the ocean to then be sold to these colonists to be workers for them. And so slavery is going to be across the colonies. It's going to be all the way from New York and New Jersey down to Georgia and South Carolina, and all the way from top to bottom. We are going to see this is going to play a major role in the shaping of the United States of America. But for the most part, what's important today to understand is that if you lived during this time in the American colonies, if you were a man, you would be a farmer, you would be working the fields, and you would be taking part in the government of your colony, for the most part. If you were a woman, you were going to be working at home. You would not be vocal. You would not have the right to vote. You would basically be under the control of the husband, who would then tell you basically how to think, what to do, everything. And then the third is the life of a slave, who would then have been taken from Africa, brought to the American colonists, and then sold to a colonist to then work. The life of a slave would obviously have been horrible. They had no rights. They were property of the colonists who had purchased them. And that's the life going on in the colonies during this time period, at the same time as the colonies are getting more independent from England. So today was about the colonies and their development, the people that were living here, the roles that they would have played. But your assignment today, and again, I want to make sure you remember, turn in your assignments on the day, this day, to me, so I can put you in for participation and attendance to say that you were in class. But New Amsterdam, I am not going to tell you anything about it. You are going to give me by this time you understand the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why that we have done before. Tell me all about it, what happened to it, where was it, everything you can find about New Amsterdam. The 5 W's generally is going to be about a half page to explain what's going on. Sometimes it stretches to 3/4 of a page. Let me see so you can see it. And so this is what I want you to do right now. I want you to go and look up New Amsterdam. I want you to tell me what you find, explain the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, and why. And then anything else you can find out about it to make it a half page to 3/4 of a page, send that to me. You guys have been doing great work. I look forward to seeing you next class.